Right, a little bit of a change of tack now because we're going to speak to Sharron Davies, the Olympian and broadcaster, about Labour, Sharron, and whether it might have a woman problem. Now, the former head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, a lady called Baroness Faulkner, has suggested that the Labour Party has both abandoned women and feminism. I mean, it's quite the claim, isn't it, Sharron? Lovely to see you this morning. Do you think she's right? She's talking about a sort of support for trans rights against single-sex spaces, but she's also talking about the grooming gangs and the lack of inquiry and then the calling of an inquiry, but then the inquiry itself has courted a degree of controversy after a number of survivors abandoned the process. Do you think she's right?
Yes, I do. I mean, obviously, I speak very much, for sport and for the fact that we've been allowing men to compete in women's sport now for a very long time. But for the last 10 years, I've been talking about it. I think Baroness Faulkner is a very clever lady. I mean, I think what she's done with the guidance is she's interpreted the law. And the problem is that there's a number of backbenchers and trans activists inside the Labour Party that don't like the law. So even though the law is the law and the law has always been the law, it's been misrepresented. The Equality Act of 2010 has been misrepresented by particular individuals like Gendered Intelligence, Stonewall. I know this from sport. I know what they were given. It was Stonewall's version of the law, not the actual law. And unfortunately, no risk assessments were ever done at the beginning of that process. No one said, look, what is going to happen to women's sport or women's private spaces or women's prisons if we allow biological males to go into them. And yet we're talking about doing a risk assessment now about the cost to industry to take them out. I mean, the whole thing is a bit bizarre, really. You cannot protect something if you can't define it. And really what the Supreme Court did very, very clearly in April was to say that sex, whenever we talk about it, means biological sex. And that is really important. Otherwise women have no rights whatsoever. If anyone can identify into our sex, we have no rights anymore. And sadly, it isn't just the Labour Party. It's the Lib Dems, it's the Greens, it's certainly the SNP. Given their way, they would have self-identification.
Yes. And it's interesting, isn't it? You mentioned the Supreme Court ruling, which was back in April. That's 8 months on. We had the Women's Institute come out this week and say we are no longer going to admit trans women because of that ruling. And yet other organisations and institutions, Sharron, seem to be dragging their feet. Let's first of all talk about sport. Where are we with trans women competing in women's sport now?
So we still have 34 sports, would you believe, in this country that allow men to identify into women's sport. And it tends not to affect the elite because we've managed to pressurise them into protecting the elite, which is literally 1%. These are the very, very top of our sports. So the pathways, the juniors, the recreational, they're still not protected. And where do we get our elite from if they don't come through, from the pathways? We just heard table tennis yesterday have decided that they will stop men from competing in women's sport, but they're not doing it until August of next year. Why August of next year when the law is what the law is right now? So, my advice to you, if you're a table tennis player and you're being made to play against a male and you're a female, demand that they apply the law right now. I set up the Women's Sports Union with Tracy Edwards of Maiden Fame, and our intention is very much to try and hold the feet of the the CEOs of all these governing bodies to the fire to say you must now protect your female athletes. All female athletes are worthy of protection, not just that 1%. So that is where we are.
That's a very interesting point, actually, because, of course, we've heard from the Olympic Committee and others. The other thing is, the clue is in the name Supreme Court. That's the judgment. They've had 8 months now to decide how to play this. It's very, very clear. It's defining trans women as men, basically, and saying biological sex must reign supreme. Then you look at other organisations, for instance, the NHS. I don't want to go into the details of Jennifer Melly's case because it's about to be heard and it would require us to read a lot of different rights of reply. But in general, we've had the NHS dragging their feet on this. Still seemingly waiting for guidance to make guidance up.
And the Sandy Peggy case as well, exactly the same. And what's frustrating is that women are having to crowdfund to raise the money to fight national bodies like the NHS who are using the taxpayers' money to fight to break the law. This is the most ridiculous situation ever, that women, can't get our government to stand up and apply the law. So, and, we are, one at a time, we are trying to take these organisations on, the Women's Institute, the Girl Guiding. That was brought by individual women and by parents of young girls. to say, we need you to protect this organisation, which has got charitable status, to be for young girls. And then we've got the people who own these organisations, who run them, apologising for the fact that they're protecting young girls. I mean, it is a ludicrous state of affairs that we've got ourselves into. And the government needs to step up. Bridget Phillipson has had this guidance on her desk now for 3 months. And I have seen it because obviously we know the Times leaked that a few weeks ago. And it categorically says that sport must be run by biological sex. And any sport that's not doing that is actually guilty of indirect sex discrimination. So be wary, because in the new year, Tracy and I will be coming for you, individual sports. We really will.
I wouldn't want you coming for me, Sharron, honestly. I think the organisations and indeed the government will defend themselves by saying, look, they're taking legal advice. And as you and I both know, that can take some time, not least if lawyers are charging by the hour. Let's just move on to another controversial topic that's reared its head again this week. And that's this puberty blocker trial. Now, we had a situation where the Cass report came out. Let's just use the precise language that she used, that there was not enough evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty blockers being prescribed to children who wanted to transition to the opposite sex. We now have this trial being carried out by the NHS and King's College London. Hannah Barnes, who wrote a very interesting book about what went on with the gender identity services at Tavistock, has raised concerns about this. What are your feelings?
Well, my feeling right now is that Wes Streeting must own this. If he's going to allow this trial, to go ahead with 200, new young children that are going to be experimented on, when we have over 2,000 that have gone through the Tavistock, what's weird about that is they've lost the ongoing results. Well, why aren't we finding what happened to these young people long term? Why do we need to experiment on more young people? Puberty is not an illness. Treating puberty as if we can just stop it and then come back to it or drop it or pretend we don't need it is utterly ridiculous. And young children are not allowed to drink, drive a car, have a tattoo because they're not old enough to make these decisions. How they can then be old enough to say that they're happy to be potentially sterilised and be medicalised for the rest of their life is quite extraordinary. We should not be, blocking children's puberty, and we should use the evidence that we have, not start experimenting all over again.
And the counter-narrative to that, Sharron, being that a child is so unhappy, they feel that they're in the wrong body, they want to transition to the opposite sex. The only way that they can do that is to stop puberty, to ensure, in the case of a female, that they don't grow breasts and all the rest of it. There have been cases where these children have claimed to be suicidal. And if you stop treating that, then you could be jeopardising children in the opposite direction. What's your response to that?
I would say that we need to give these young children a great deal of support and cognitive help. The statistics will show us actually the suicide rates post-transgenderism is higher. So again, it's really important that we deal with facts, not feelings. And the facts tell us that it doesn't fix their mental health problems, their anxiety problems, and they're massively overrepresented with children that have been sexually abused or autistic or come from care homes. 4 times as many children identify as trans that come from care homes. Why are not TV programs doing shows about that? Why are they not doing investigative journalism about why that is the case? Why do some schools have 25% of their kids identify and other schools has none? There is a huge gender social contagion that goes with this cult almost, and young people should not be told that they can magically change sex, because that is not the case. They will never be able to change their biological sex, ever.
All right. Sharron Davies, thank you once again for coming on the show and also for speaking so clearly. I know you feel very passionately about this. Good to see you on a Sunday morning. Thank you.
Thank you.